I'm going to come on now and ask you about some of the detail about the Lansley announcements, if I can call them those, in January 2011. First question is in relation to the annual payments. So they had already been paid to those with HIV, as we saw this morning. The new announcement was that they would be paid to those with hepatitis C stage 2 under the Skipton Fund stages. What is your understanding as to why those that were co-infected didn't get two payments, so one for their HIV and one for their hepatitis C stage 2?
They did. Sorry, did you say didn't?
Yes, I did. They did.
They did get. Oh, sorry, I misheard you. So that yes, you're right. They did get two payments, one for HIV and one for hepatitis C. And again, we took some legal advice on that. And although I can't remember the details of the legal advice, I believe it's probably buried somewhere in some of the documentation. But I think the advice was basically that there was no rational basis for not increasing the payment for those who were co-infected. If we had chosen a partial or a percentage of an additional 12,800, that we would have no rational basis upon which to choose that figure, and therefore it was perfectly reasonable to offer two payments.
So my understanding was that they only got one payment.
No, they should. My understanding is they got two.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a matter of fact which we can establish.
I think the questions that you were asking were not as well formulated as they may have been for the purpose of the witness's understanding. So, but we can be clear. We are talking about you're saying they got one payment, whereas your evidence is they got two.
Yes.
Then, can I ask you then about the? I'm going to ask you about the some elements of the process next, and can we start then by looking at DHSC 6699456. So this is a letter dated the 22nd of March to Right Honourable Andrew Lansley MP, and it's from, if we go to the second page, we can see that it's from Michael McGimpsey, Minister for Health, Social Services and... third page, sorry. Michael McGimpsey, MLA, Minister for Health, Social Services and Public Safety. And then if we go back to the first page, he says this, further to my correspondence, 11th of February, and your response on the 22nd of February. I'm writing to you about the circumstances surrounding the publication of the Contaminated Blood Review report published by the Department of Health and announced by you to the UK Parliament on 10th of January. I've spoken to Edwina Hart and Nicola Sturgeon. Just pausing there, is it right to understand Edwina Hart is the Minister for Health in Wales and Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland?
That's right.
And we all share the same concerns on the lack of engagement by the Department of Health with the three devolved administrations on the review and recommendations for additional financial support. Despite a commitment in Anne Milton's letter of 13 October 2010 that I would be consulted on any recommendations which touched on matters for Northern Ireland, I was not kept fully informed with developments of the review, nor did I have an opportunity to comment on the likely recommendations for additional support and their associated costs. In December 2010, similar to other devolved administrations, I did receive a copy of the draft Medical Expert Working Group report, which reviewed the natural history of the hepatitis C infections, which in due course became an annex to the final report. However, this gave no indication of the likely outcome of the review overall. Only in December 2010 did your officials share information on the provisional financial implications with my officials. This information also did not give any indication of policy direction you were likely to take. Repeated requests were made for sight of the final review report for an understanding of its likely content. This situation has clearly undermined the Memorandum of Understanding between the UK Government and devolved administrations. Go over the page. The support provided to those affected by contaminated blood is currently a UK-wide arrangement which could only be changed by the agreement of all UK health departments. You took the decision unilaterally to implement the recommendations of the review, and this has put additional and unexpected financial pressures on the Department of Health and Social Services and Public Safety and Public Safety's budget without our prior agreement. The statement of funding policy agreed between HM Treasury and devolved administrations is quite clear where the financial responsibility lies in these circumstances. It states where decisions taken by UK departments or agencies lead to additional costs for any of the devolved administrations, where other arrangements do not exist automatically to adjust for such extra costs, the body whose decision leads to the additional cost will meet that cost. And then he concludes by effectively asking for the department to meet the additional costs for those individuals in Northern Ireland who access the fund, and he sets out the estimation of what he thinks that will cost. Now, first of all, do you recall, would you have seen this letter, do you think?
Probably, yes.
And do you accept the factual position that's set out there? That
Broadly, yes. We did share, I mean, the review was very fast moving. We shared information with the devolved administrations as we could, and we certainly did share some information about the financial implications of the review as it stood in December 2010, I think that was. And yes, it's correct that we did not inform the devolved administrations of the intention of the Department of Health.
And why was that, given that, as is set out in this letter, there was a UK-wide agreement about the provisions for those that are infected?
I have to say, because I was instructed not to. And to try and put that into context, our ministers had made a decision about the direction in which they wanted to go. It's important to remember that although we tried to certainly from my point of view, in my policy area, we tried to ensure we had as good a working relationship as possible with our colleagues in the devolved administrations. They were different governments. And I think our minister's concern, certainly my senior civil servant's concern, was that there was a risk of leakage, shall we say, ahead of Mr. Lansley's announcement if too much information was shared. I have to say the same would work in the opposite direction. I mean, you know, there are some things that the devolved administrations quite rightly wouldn't be able to share either with each other or with us. So they were different governments. I must admit I felt uncomfortable, but that was the situation that we were in. And Mr. Lansley did try in his statement to make it as clear as possible that this was England-only announcement, and obviously it was for the devolved administrations then to consider whether they wanted to do something similar.
And do you remember, or what was there to your recollection, a discussion or a concern that there should be parity between all four countries?
We had, I think, on a number of occasions discussed that at official level, certainly, with the devolved administrations, and we'd all agreed that, you know, that was our preferred way forward, obviously subject to ministerial views. I don't think at an official level we had a different view at this stage.
And so was that really what was making you feel uncomfortable about not sharing the information with the devolved administrations, given that it would be important to take them along with you.
Yes, and also, of course, we'd made we had said that we would work closely with them. So I did feel uncomfortable about it. I understood the reasons, but I did feel uncomfortable.
And we don't need to go to this, but the response from Mr. Lansley is at DHSC 6587750, and was a right to point out, is this right that although a request was made here for the department to pay for the share of the costs that are being increased in Northern Ireland, in fact all the devolved administrations paid their own share?
Yes, they funded their own share, yes.
Can I then ask you some questions next about the need for proof for those applying to the Skipton Fund, the new cohort applying to the Skipton Fund as a result of Mr. Lansley's announcement that those who had died before 29th of August 2003 could now apply. And I'm also going to ask you about that, the cut-off date as well. Those are the other two issues I want to pick up with you in relation to that. So could we go please to ABMU 5015. And here we have a letter to you from, we'll see at the end, it's from Dr. Hay, as he then was, who's chairman of the UK HCDO. And if we go back to the first page, we can see it's written on the 18th of January 2011, so a week or so after the announcement. And he says this at the second paragraph down: the deadline set for registration of dependents of deceased patients, and just pausing there, what he's referring to there is the fact that in the announcement, Andrew Lansley stated that while these claims could be made, they had to be made by the end of March 2011. Right. Is that right?
Yes.
So that's what he's talking about. The deadline set for registration of dependents of deceased patients appears arbitrary and does not give adequate time to trace these individuals, most of whom will have been out of touch with their haemophilia centre for years. That the date chosen is the last day of the financial year strikes a sour note in a report that will otherwise generally be very much welcomed. And then he goes on to say this: the National Haemophilia Database can help to facilitate this process by providing centres with a list of names, first of those who have died from liver disease, whose dependents should be eligible for a stage 2 payment. We hold death certification data and treatment data on such patients. Would I be right in saying that this NHD data should satisfy the Skipton Fund should that patient's notes have been destroyed? Go over the page. Many notes will have been destroyed since there is only a legal obligation to retain notes for 6 years. We can also share this data with the Skipton Fund if they consider this a valid form of preliminary registration. And then he goes on to say this: tracing deceased patients who have died from other causes but who may nevertheless be eligible for a stage 1 payment is even more challenging, since there are far more of them. I am not sure that this category of patient was fully considered in your estimates or our discussions. NHD can draw up a list of patients now dead who are known to have been exposed to blood components of blood products during the years of risk. Up to 30% of those patients will have cleared the virus spontaneously, and a further proportion will have no documented abnormal liver function tests or destroyed notes. It would take centres a long time to review the notes if they still exist. The HCV look-back exercise would provide all of this data, but not by the end of March. I am concerned that there may be many speculative registrations by dependents who do not know if they have a valid claim, but who are anxious to beat the deadline. I assume the Skipton Fund will contact patients already registered and/or their centres directly. Let me know what is envisaged. And then he says at the end, please provide me with contact details for the devolved administrations so that I can contact them. they are telling their clinicians that this announcement caught them by surprise, so a decision may not emerge before the end of the month. One wonders what deadlines they will give for dependents of patients who died before the inception of the Skipton Fund. It would be unfortunate if a difference in conditions arose. So that's the letter that you've got there, and what he seems to be raising there is 2 points. First of all, concern that there is a deadline at all, and secondly, the practical consequences of that is how on earth do these people who want to apply get the evidence that they would need. And then if we can go to a DHSC 5655747, we can see a further email communications copied into you, and then which you then pick up with your colleagues. So if we start, please, at page 10. We've got here, again, from Charles Hay, 25th of January. This time it's to Nick Fish at the Skipton, and you're CC'd in with a number of others. And it says that he's attaching his letter to the Department of Health, to which he's had no response. I'm assuming that's the one we've just looked at. And then he says this: I think we are all concerned that patients may fall through the net because they don't know about it, or because of the deadline. We are trying to get haemophilia centres to bring it to their patients' attention, and will be providing patients with lists of patients that they may or may not be able to contact. Quite sure what's meant there. We are also concerned that some applications may fail because of lack of supporting documentation. This will be unavoidable to some degree for the following reasons. And then he sets out that notes may have been destroyed or lost. Patient may have died before the advent of HCV antibody testing in 1992, or HCV PCR testing several years later. And then he says in the pre-testing era, non-A, non-B hepatitis was defined by exclusion of alcohol, hepatitis A and hepatitis B in patients with abnormal liver function tests for more than 6 months. For some of the patients who died a long time ago, that, plus a history of treatment with a high-risk product, may be the only evidence of chronic hepatitis C there is. That would persuade me. Would it be adequate for Skipton? What's your minimum data set? In some cases, there is documented evidence of severe liver disease on the death certificate. And then he says, we have death certification data from ONS that we can provide you with. Then if we turn to page 9, we can see the response from Nick Fish of the 27th of January, again copied into you. And if we pick it up the 3rd paragraph down, I share your concerns on some people being unable to furnish sufficient evidence for the purpose of their application. However, we hope, with a combination of 1, information printed on the death certificate, 2, records retained by the estate, records held at haemophilia centres, 3, records retained by the estate, and 4, records which still exist at the hospital and or GP surgery, most people will be able to receive a payment where it is due. For applications which are declined, there is always the appeal system, whereby the medical knowledge and experience of the panel members may be sufficient to overturn unsuccessful applications. And then he sets out the paragraph I've just read about what would be the minimum data set, and he said, we would need guidance from the Department of Health on this matter. And then if we turn over the page, well, in fact, I don't think we need to pick this up, but it just says at the top, for any living applicants who are struggling to obtain records of their treatment with blood products, I will refer them to you. So that's the correspondence between them. And then if we pick it up, please, at page 6, page 5, no, page 6. Sorry, page 7. Try all the pages. No, we've just looked. Yes, that's right. Sorry. Page 5. Getting myself muddled up. We can see an email from you at the bottom to what looks like a range of your colleagues. Is that right? On the 28th of January?
Yes, that's correct, yes.
And then if we turn over the page, we can see what you say. down at the bottom. Dear all, you will see the email below that Charles Hay is in direct contact with the Skipton Fund, so that's part of the email train that you're forwarding. The UK HCD is working hard to be as helpful as possible in trying to identify individuals with bleeding disorders from the pre-2003 cohort who may have had hepatitis C and provide records to families who request them. The haemophilia centres are prepared to invest effort in doing this in respect to former patients, for which I have thanked them. It is possible, though, that some of their employing trusts may not be prepared to sanction this without payment. Just pausing there, that's the point you made earlier, isn't it? That it is one thing for those that have got haemophilia centres, but those that have had transfusions in hospitals are in a different situation.
Yes.
Having spoken to Matthew Birkinshaw, I understand that trusts are entitled to charge for cost recovery under the Access to Health Records 1990, although individual trust policies vary. It's also possible that we may be asked by individuals who may want to claim in respect of someone who has died whether DH will reimburse charges incurred to obtain medical records. Just to be clear, it's not our policy to do so. Again, just pausing there, it was an exception made to that policy for these cohort?
Not that I remember, no.
Do you know why that was?
No, I'm afraid I can't help you with that.
And then you say, as it's likely that many pre-2003 records will have been destroyed, Matthew advises that we may also receive complaints about that. And then information about how to access records. And then you say this over the page. Secondly, please note Charles and Nick's exchange on what might constitute reasonable evidence of treatment-acquired Hep C infection in the pre-testing era, i.e. before 1991. And then again, you set out what Dr. Now Professor Hay said about that. And you go on to say, Nick Fish is seeking DH's view on whether that would be acceptable, grateful for advice, and then ask for advice, and whether or not you would need to give instructions to Skipton. And then just lastly on this, if we go to page 2, there are other emails in between, but this is an email from, it looks like Graham Kent to Ailsa White of 28th of January. And he makes the point at the bottom of that page, the important thing is to get it right now, because there are clearly going to be some very real evidential problems in relation to people who died a minimum of more than 7 years ago, and in some cases, maybe many more than that. Indeed, I am just turning to drafting a new agreement. That's an agreement between the Department of Health and Skipton, going over the page now, using the existing agreement as a model. And he says, it seems to me, sorry, I haven't been very clear. What I understand him to be saying is this, right? That you can, the instructions to Skipton can go into the agreement between the Department of Health and Skipton.
Yes, that's.
So don't worry about what's been said in the past. We can give them new instructions.
Yes, yes, that's my understanding.
And it's right, as I understand from the agency agreement, that what in fact happened was that the Department of Health effectively left it to Skipton and said, you provide us with the eligibility criteria for this cohort. Is that your understanding?
To be honest with you, I'm not sure that I've seen that paperwork, or if I have, it's only arrived very recently, so I can't confirm that. But that would certainly not surprise me.
Do you know whether you or your colleagues during your time there undertook any kind of review of, first of all, the criteria that was being applied by Skipton for this cohort, given all the evidential difficulties that we've looked at, whether or not a review of what the criteria was, and how that was being applied, and whether it was being but it had been drawn, the bar had been put too high so that genuine applicants couldn't make applications?
I don't think we undertook a review. That I would say. I can't remember one. What I do remember is that we had regular meetings with the Skipton Fund. So that would be Peter Stevens and Nick Fish. And Nick kept very detailed records of the numbers of applications that they'd received. So there's no personal identification here, but anonymised data on numbers of applications that they'd received at both stage 1 and stage 2, how many had been accepted straight away, if you like, how many had been rejected, how many went to the appeals panel, and what the overturn rate was in terms of decisions by the appeals panel. And although I don't remember the detail, I know we were provided regularly with that information. And I also remember that Skipton, and certainly in the earlier days at this stage, the appeals panel worked very hard to try and make as fair a judgment as they possibly could on the evidence, albeit incomplete in some cases. And clearly, after we look at the 2003 or the pre-2003 applications, it became even more difficult. And this correspondence is sort of anticipating that, really. But they made every effort to try and make a fair as judgment as possible based on sometimes very limited evidence.
And so that data that you have identified that the department was in receipt of, did that give you any cause for concern about how this part of the process was working?
Not that I remember, no.
Now I'm going to move on to the other part that Professor Hay raised in that email, and that's the cut-off date. And you said in your statement, we don't need to go to it, but paragraph 21.2 for those that are following the statement, that you and many others considered that initial cut-off date announced by Andrew Lansley, that those that had died before the 29th of August 2003, who could now apply, their estates could now apply for a payment from Skipton, had to do so by the end of March, so just a little bit over 2.5 months.
Yes.
That cut-off date was wrong and unfair. So I think I'm sorry, terribly sorry. I've just realised I think I've missed.
I think
I've missed. Let me start again. In your statement, you say that the cut-off date that was implied initially when Skipton was.
That's right.
Came into force, that was unfair.
That was the one. The two. I mean, although I think I understood why it had been decided upon, but we felt that excluding applicants pre-August 2003 from the Skipton Fund was unfair, and that's why the review addressed that, because we wanted to try and do something about it. So I think that's what you're asking.
You're quite right. So forget what I said earlier.
Yes.
That's not what your witness statement says. And it's right as well. Is it that's a view that was shared by? It wasn't just a view you held. It was shared by colleagues.
No, it was a shared view. I agree.
Now I getting on to the announcement by Andrew Lansley. He made an announcement that cohort could apply to the Skipton Fund, but they would need to do so by the end of March 2011. And you've explained in your statement the reason for that. So can you just explain to us why that was said?
It was financial again. There was money available, as I remember it, in 2000. So we were in financial year 2011-12 at this point. So the financial year ended on the 31st of March 2010-11. The financial year ended on the 31st of March 2011. There was apparently, finance colleagues told us and told ministers, money available to make these back payments, if you like to call them that, within that financial year's envelope, but it was going to be very, very difficult in the subsequent financial year, 11-12. And therefore, I think the term finance used was they wanted to try and score as many payments against the current financial year as was possible. And so ministers decided the best way forward was to incentivise applicants to come forward quickly. And that's why that apparent cut-off date of the 31st of March was put in place. But we were always very clear within the department that there was no intention to make that an absolute deadline, and that applications beyond that would indeed be considered. It was an incentivization, really, I think.
And that was there an understanding in the department that deadline was probably unrealistic for most,
many,
if not all of the applicants?
Yeah, it certainly recognised that it was going to be very difficult for many of the applicants, and we were a bit concerned that it would create anxiety amongst people, feeling that they were so pressurised in having to come forward so quickly and that they may not be able to get the evidence. So that was difficult, but it was weighed up against, again, the desire to try and get as many of these applications in as possible within the funding envelope available in that financial year, and so the decision was made to go ahead as you've set out.
And was there a concern that announcement and that deadline may actually stop people from applying because they would simply not be able to make the deadline?
No, I don't think that was considered in any detail at the time. I think the intention was that it would be made clear at the end of the financial year that the deadline was extended, and so people would, at that stage, still be able to come forward.
Now, I know the inquiry has sent you a submission, not authored by yourself, but by one of your colleagues, suggesting that deadline should be extended. We don't need to go to it, but for those that want to, it's WITN 0823047. But you say in your witness statement you don't know whether that announcement was made, and you're not sure what actually happened.
No, I'm not sure whether it was made as a formal announcement. I honestly can't remember.
So there may have been a formal announcement, or it may just have been you carried on accepting applications.
Yes.
And would you accept that there ought to have been a formal announcement?
Yes. It may have been. I should just say I don't know the answer to this, but it may have been that the announcement was made, if you like, to all the bodies that would have expected people to approach them. So it may have been done through those routes.
You were also asked by the inquiry, and you've addressed in your witness statement, the steps taken to advertise these new changes to ensure that those that might be eligible for payment knew about it and could make a decision about whether to apply. You've set out the steps that were taken in your witness statement, and I don't think I need to go through those, but it's right to understand, isn't it, that you were availing yourself of effectively professional networks within the NHS?
Certainly.
The charitable and other organisations that were there to support those people that have been infected or affected.
Yes.
So the trusts and schemes themselves, the Hepatitis C Trust.
That's right, the third sector organisations, yes.
And then the Department of Health Twitter feed.
That's right,
websites,
yes,
and so on. What wasn't, and I also should say the sort of PR machine of the Department of Health as well. So
yes.
Trying to get the story out into the media. So there's
That's
reference
right.
to a Times article and
Yes.
so on. What you didn't do was undertake any paid media campaign. What was the reason for that?
I think, if I remember this correctly, I think it was because of the cost. So there was a decision made that we wouldn't use paid-for advertising, but that we would use every other route that we could possibly find that was available to us.
I mean, looking at that decision now seems rather odd given the amount of money that's being spent on payments and so on. We're talking about millions of pounds.
I must admit, I can't really comment on that because I've no idea how much paid-for advertising would cost, I'm afraid. So someone else probably knew that, I didn't.
Another point another question arises from the sort of media campaign is this. Would you, what regard was given to the fact that the Department of Health, well, did the Department of Health consider the professional clinical networks in the devolved administrations to get the message out in the devolved administrations, or was there really a focus on England?
There was a focus on England because obviously once the devolved administrations had decided what they wanted to do, they would have used their own networks to get their own messages out.
So this was a message very much rooted in the announcement from
England,
from
yes.
England.
Yes.
And so you, even once the devolved administrations had come on board, that would have been a matter for them to
yes,
get the message out.
Remember some of those routes were in fact cross UK routes anyway, but such as the haemophilia doctors, for example, and I'm sure some of the other professional networks, but I'm sure the devolved administrations would have had their own routes as well.
I'm going to come on now to ask you a handful of questions about the setup of the Caxton Foundation. First of all, I want to ask you a little bit about this principle that we see reflected in the documentation, that it was important for the Department of Health to have parity across the three charities, the Macfarlane Trust, the Eileen Trust and the Caxton Foundation for beneficiaries. What did you understand that to mean?
That what we wanted to, well, just going back a step, what we wanted to try and do was to give those infected and affected with hepatitis C access to the same types of payment that those with HIV already received. There wasn't a mechanism for discretionary payments for those with hepatitis C, so that's why Caxton was actually set up, and we felt that it should broadly be in line, it should broadly operate in a similar way to Macfarlane and Eileen.
So one of the decisions that came to the department while you were there was an application by Caxton to fund a discretionary top-ups scheme. So for those that were getting in the same way that they had in Macfarlane, they were topping up beneficiaries' income up to above the payments being given by the MFET. And that was turned down by the department. How does that square with this principle of parity?
I'm not sure that I remember the detail of that, actually. Do you have any documentation?
Yeah, so we can look at I think the bid is AHOH 601. So this is the business case for increased funding to the Caxton Foundation from 2014-15 for a regular payments scheme. And it sets out the background there. If we go down, down to the bottom, one of the most striking trends which has emerged as a result of the grants programme after the last 2 years is that there are a number of people who regularly approach Caxton for support and who are clearly struggling to meet their own needs because of extremely low income levels. And right at the bottom, as a result of its experience over the last 2 years, Caxton would therefore like to introduce a form of regular payments to beneficiaries based on their income levels to enable everyone to have the means to live without the fear of not being able to meet basic living costs or getting into debt. And then the document goes on to set out various different costings as to how what they could offer and what that would cost. And then if we look at CAXT 40110_089, we can see, I believe, the response to that business case for increased funding. Thank you for your submitting your case. Minister decided this is not the right time for an uplift in allocation, whilst they continue how best to address a range of issues about the system of support available for those affected by contaminated blood. I'm sorry that I'm not able to confirm a Caxton allocation and so on, and I recognise that this will be disappointing news.
Okay, I think perhaps the context here is important. So as the letter from Dr. White says, ministers were considering a lot of things about the system of support. They were actually thinking, I believe, by this stage about pretty much overhauling the system of payments. Also, there were some still significant financial pressures, I believe, on the department in terms of, the sort of fallout from the financial crash in 2008, and there was still very much, I think, how we often used to refer to it as downward pressure on public spending, and certainly the departmental funds. So yes, we wanted broad parity between Caxton, Macfarlane and Eileen, but there was a decision, I believe, at this stage that things might change fairly significantly in the near future, and therefore let's not do it now.
I'm going to pick up on some issues in relation to funding in a moment, but just sticking primarily in relation to Macfarlane, but sticking now just with a couple more issues I've got for you on the Caxton. The failure, or the fact that the Caxton didn't appoint a user trustee, at least certainly in the first year, although they did have somebody with lived experience of hepatitis C after a little while. Now we know from the documents from the trustee that the process of appointing a trustees in Caxton was rather slightly different from that in Macfarlane,
Yes.
in that it was for the Caxton trustees to identify potential trustees and then to
Yes.
put those forward to the Department of Health,
Yes.
for the Department of Health to consent
Yes,
to.
the three founding trustees put together the original or the initial Caxton board, and then yes, you're right, it was for them.
Can you recall whether you gave any thought to this issue yourself? Whether or not it might be appropriate to have a user trustee, that, given problems that had arisen at Macfarlane, that this might be a way of beneficiaries' interest being represented on the
Well,
board?
I mean, Macfarlane did indeed have beneficiary. Well, I'm not sure how many, but certainly it did have beneficiaries as trustees at some stage. Although I think perhaps not by this stage. I'm not quite sure. We left it. We did. I don't remember that we explicitly thought about that when the trustee was being drawn up. It was simply a case of identifying the founding trustees and then letting them decide how they wanted to constitute the board.
So effectively, that was a matter, as far as the department was concerned, or insofar
Yes.
as you know, that was left to the Caxton. It was not a matter that the department was to be involved in. And as you became aware of tensions between the trust, the Caxton Foundation, and their beneficiaries, do you think that's something that you should have put your mind to?
The tensions that I was aware of, I don't think, as far as I understand it, they were mainly because of administrative, well, this was my recollection of it, administrative problems, slowness in responses, not something that would immediately have drawn my thoughts to, well, this is happening, this would be improved if there was a beneficiary on the Board of Trustees.
And another issue, another question about trustees. Did you have any concerns about Charles Lister being put forward as an appointment as a trustee for Caxton, not because of any personal characteristics that he has, but because of his role as the former head of blood policy?
No, I had no concerns about that at all. He's a man of, great integrity, and I had personally no doubt that he would be able to separate his departmental or ex-departmental hat, if you like, from any work he was doing on the Caxton board.
So is this right, that there wasn't a concern, certainly expressed by you or to your knowledge at any of your colleagues, that there may be a perception amongst the beneficiary community that it would create a lack of independence from the department?
No.
Do you think that's something the department should have been concerned about?
Again, no, I don't. I wouldn't have said so. I mean, the trustees were appointed on merit, and they were chosen by the founding trustees. I don't think it was something that was of concern to me. I must admit, I never heard it expressed as a concern. So if it was, then that's news to me.
I'm going to ask you now some questions about the sponsorship role of the Alliance House organisations generally. Just checking the timer up, couldn't quite read it right. Generally, which I think you've already told us came under your remit in 2012.
Yeah, yes, it was just
2012.
the very end of 2011, I think, yes.
One moment. Can I just check something before I go on to another topic? Right. I'm asked to remind you. Can we have up on screen, please? WITN 082 3003. Paragraph, it's page 32. This is your third witness statement, and it's about user trustees. So you were asked a question about the appointment of user trustees, and at 25.2, you say you've been asked this question about the decision not to appoint a user trustee, and you say, in answer, I was not. And then if we go over the page, you say that you had conversations about it and that you were sympathetic to the idea, but you recognise the potential conflicts of interest should a beneficiary be appointed. So you were content with his judgment to proceed without a user or a beneficiary trust.
Yes, I mean we were told by I think it was Roger Evans at a meeting with Roger Evans that the three founding trustees had decided not to appoint a user trustee, but as I've said there, I think my understanding of that was that he meant a beneficiary. But we accepted their decision. It was their decision.
So moving then on to the issue of the sort of general sponsorship of the Alliance House organisations, they're an independent charity, answerable to the Charity Commission, but you also have as you say, a sponsorship role in terms of ensuring they're delivering against their objectives.
Yes.
So how do you square those two potentially opposing principles?
I'm not sure that they do oppose, actually. We, as you say, were their sole funders. I mean, charities, even the Charity Commission, I believe, does say somewhere in its guidance that charities should take account of, providing information, etc., to their funders. So we were asking the charities to let us know what they were doing to keep us appraised. But you're quite right that they were independent of the department. I mean, part of the problem we recognise was that certainly beneficiaries did not always believe that they were independent of the department, and I believe sometimes the trustees of some of the charities thought that they were not independent of the department, but in fact they were. We did not, certainly in my time, we didn't interfere in their policy decisions.
So in terms of ensuring they're delivering against their objectives in your sponsorship role, did that include ensuring they're delivering against their charitable objectives, or was that really their financial objectives?
I mean, making sure that they were spending, if you like, so because we were, as civil servants, we had to be able to report to ministers on how the money was being spent and how beneficiaries were being supported. So we needed sufficient information to enable us to do that. We wanted to understand how they assessed charitable need, and certainly there were occasions when we asked them to just explain to us how they were assessing charitable need so that we understood that, but it was for them to make the decisions about how they did that.
And I'm going to come on to look at one of the documents in which precisely that question is asked. Did the department, as part of the calling to account, if you like, the charities, look at the processes that the charities used to deliver to the beneficiaries, and whether they were fair and whether they were appropriate? Is that part of your remit?
Not that I recall. I'm not quite sure what you mean by processes.
So, for example, how they treated the applicants, whether the requirement for the evidential burden was fair, whether it was unduly...
I don't remember that we ever got into that level of detail, no. Again, that was for the trustees to make judgments about how they implemented those sorts of things.
And to what extent did you liaise with the devolved administrations in carrying out sponsorship and policy oversight of the Alliance House organisations, given that health was devolved?
Yes, I mean, we didn't sort of have any formal discussions about it as far as I'm aware. I think we may have appraised the other administrations. We may have talked more about Skipton Fund and how that was funded, but I don't think we discussed that in any, the oversight of the Alliance House organisations with the devolved administrations, unless they had questions that they wanted to ask, or unless there was something very specific that we felt they should know.
And did you, to what extent did you ensure that the Alliance House organisations were discharging their obligations as regards beneficiaries from the devolved administrations, as opposed to those that were within England?
I'm not sure that we had a particular a particular mechanism for doing that. I think if there were any concerns, the devolved administrations would probably have raised them with us, because their population of beneficiaries, I think, would probably quite rapidly have gone to their own health departments. But I don't remember there being any formal mechanism for that.
I just want to look at the impact of the McFarlane Trust reserves on the funding decisions that were made during your time. Can we go, first of all, to MACF 5061_104? So this is a meeting note from a McFarlane Trust DH annual review meeting on the 8th of December 2011. You're there with your colleagues Ailsa White and Ben Cole, and then from the McFarlane we've got Chairman Christopher Fitzgerald, CEO Martin Harvey, Linda Haig, I believe, is financial. I'm not sure who Gillian Brown is, but I don't know whether you remember.
No, I'm afraid I can't remember her role specifically.
And then we start with an apology from Mr Fitzgerald about an omission in the chairman's statement. I presume he's talking about the trustees' report. And then he advises that in the previous year had seen the accumulation of a significantly lower amount, £130,000 figure for 2010-2011, had been in the region of 430,000. He said that this chairman's statement ought to explain why it had been necessary to take time to work out what to do with these funds and not to spend the money with just cause. So just pausing there, is it right to understand that at this point the McFarlane Trust reserves were in excess of £400,000? Is that your understanding?
No, I think their reserves were in excess of £4 million.
Sorry, 4 million. Beg your pardon.
That's my recollection.
Yes.
I don't think this has got anything to do with the reserve.
No, I think you're right. So we pick up the issue about the reserves at the bottom of that page. Mr Fitzgerald referred to the issue of reserves as set out in the trustees' report and chairman's statement. The original need for which had arisen from the uncertainty of securing funding from the DH year on year. MFT had built up the reserves to about 1 year's cover of total expenditure by 2006. But when in 2008 sufficient assurances as to continuity of future funding had been received from the department, the trustees to reduce the policy requirement for 6 months cover, then about 2 million, now 1 million. And then if we skip down to the next paragraph, Mrs Jecock informed that funding for all charitable bodies was under considerable scrutiny and consideration, and while there was not in a position to say anything explicit at this time, they could definitely say that for those charitable bodies fully funded by DH, reserve levels needed to be much lower than MFT's current level, and there simply could not be any justification for having higher levels. Therefore, every effort should be made to bring them down. And then there's a discussion about the time frame, and you're effectively, Mr Fitzgerald says, well, we can do it within 2 years, and Elsa White says it needs to be sooner. And then picking up at the next paragraph, which starts, Mrs Jecock said that the MFT should recognise that the reserves might have to be used for a time to fund the Trust's current commitments to beneficiaries, as financing was under tight review, and DH Finance were limiting the pot of money to cover non-NHS programmes. Ms White offered room for negotiation. And then there's a discussion about the McFarlane Trust submitting a paper on why they say the reserves need to be at the level that they are. And then right at the bottom of that page, you say this. Mrs Jecock said that the only reason for suspending discretionary payments would be the existence of reserves. And then if we go over the page just to complete this, we can see the action point arising from this is for the McFarlane Trust to produce a proposal demonstrating clearly the means by which reserves would be reduced to £100,000 to £200,000. You say closer to £100,000 by the end of 2013, and that should be submitted in the first week in January. Now, this is just one document. There's many documents over quite a long period of time, and we've looked at some of them in previous hearings. Effectively, the department saying to McFarlane Trust, your reserves are too high, you need to reduce them. And here you seem to be saying, well, look, you're actually might have to use your reserves. Instead of getting an allocation, annual allocation from the Department of Health, you're going to have to run down your reserves first and then come to us for an annual allocation. Is that the right way to read that?
I think that's broadly the right way. I mean, things did change slightly, and you may have covered this, as you say, in subsequent or in previous hearings. But here we're clearly looking, and I think this was on the advice of DH Finance, that reserves should be in the order of a few £100,000. I do remember later there seemed to have been an agreement with Macfarlane that actually aiming for £750,000 was going to be a reasonable level of reserve. But yes, there was again, I believe we took some legal advice. Clearly, the Charity Commission recommends that all charities have a reserve policy, but that policy may be that they choose not to have a reserve. Well, Macfarlane did choose to have a reserve, and as I say, I think 750k was the sort of the level that was subsequently agreed. But the department was definitely to try and get that reserve level down, thinking that actually the reserve should be drawn on first before too much more funding was given to Macfarlane. In the end, we compromised, I think. Their allocation was reduced by a relatively small amount, but that they understood that if they wanted to make up the shortfall, and obviously decisions on how much they gave out to their beneficiaries were up to them, but that they would need to use their reserve.
Was the fact that they had such a large reserve a factor taken into account by your team and the DH Finance team when they were putting in the bids for them?
I'm sure it was, yes.
So it would have had, to use your phrase, a downward pressure
Yes.
on what they would have received.
Yes, I believe that's correct. I mean, to be fair to Macfarlane, you know, they'd made some very good investment decisions which had helped them to build up such a substantial reserve. But we were very much of the view that you shouldn't sit on a reserve, you should use it for your beneficiaries.
And do you know, you may not know the answer to this, but do you know whether at the point at which allocations were being made by the Treasury, that's a sort of element that would have been taken into account, or is that just too detailed?
Yes, that may be. I just wouldn't know.
I don't know.
No.
I just want to pick up on the point that you make at the bottom of page 2 of this note of the minute of the meeting, which is that you say the only reason for suspending discretionary payments would be the existence of the reserve. So is it right to understand that you're not saying at this stage, look, we're going to reduce payments or suspend annual allocation because of downward pressure on finance at a departmental level? It's because of your reserves.
Yes, I think that's my reading of it. I must admit, I don't actually recollect that particular discussion in any detail, but I've no reason to think that the note doesn't capture it accurately.
And do you know whether this is a departmental minute or...
Could we just go back to the first page?
Yes.
Oh, I'm pretty certain. Oh, it's an annual review meeting note, yes. So that would have been a departmental note, I'm sure. Although, yes, no, I'm still sure it's a departmental note, sorry.
Would you agree that there is a certain irony, again, I'm not sure if that's the right word to use, but a certain irony in the department saying to the Macfarlane, on the one hand, you should have a small reserve because there's secure annual funding, while on the other saying, we're going to stop your secure annual funding because your reserve is too large? No,
I don't think I would agree with that. I mean, we understood that it was up to the trustees to decide whether they wanted to hold a reserve, and we'd agreed an amount with them. But there was clearly so much pressure on internal budgets that it was a way of helping them to get their reserve down, really. They were supposed to spend on the basis of financial need. They had been broadly spending, I can't remember what the amount was each year. There was no reason why they shouldn't extend that if they so wished, using their reserve. But I think our finance colleagues felt that it would be encouraging to, limit their funding to some extent.
So if we now pick it up in November 2014 at MACF 5061_067. We've got a letter here from, it's from Roger Evans to you, 5th of November, and the third paragraph down there, he makes the point that the financial position is the same as it was 12 months ago. You're aware the 2.2 million annual allocation from the department leaves us with an operational shortfall of about £800,000 per annum. As in the previous year, 2013-2014, we are having to fund this shortfall through the reserve that we still have available. We can afford to do this for a further 2 financial years. At that point, in April 2017, if we have not received an increased allocation, we will need to significantly reduce the level of support that we have been giving our beneficiaries. This will leave people who rely on this support in financial hardship and distress. And then they say we would need to give beneficiaries significant advance notice if we needed to reduce or remove payments to them, and we'd need to do this at some point in early 2016-17 if we had not already received notification of an increased allocation for 2017-2018. And then at the bottom of the page, the last paragraph there, as we made you aware, through last year's business case, for some time we've only been able to run a relatively small grants budget, which is inadequate to meet the needs of the beneficiary community. We undertook to apply our remaining reserves to fund more substantial grants programmes over the next 3 years, but still require the additional funding from the department in order to do so. Our inability to meet this need remains as a result of continued underfunding. And then the response we can see at MACF 5061_061, underscore 066. And that's 11th of December. This is a reply from you to Roger Evans. And if we pick it up at the third paragraph, I and colleagues here recognise that your board may need to consider some difficult decisions on whether to reduce or stop payments, but we are pleased that you are considering now what will be necessary to achieve financial balance. We appreciate that you've been managing the shortfall between trust expenditure and departmental funding thus far by using the trust reserves, and that this is not sustainable long term. We have discussed the financial position of the trust on a number of occasions over the past few years in the context of the significant and increasing pressure on the department's central budgets. As you know, we have expressed our concern previously about the sustainability of the trust's payment schedules. And then over the page, we would welcome further discussion of your board's intentions for establishing a more viable approach to managing its payment policies at our annual review meeting. So is this right, that by the end of 2014, the reserves have come down and the trust are saying to you, we're going to run out, we're not going to be able to keep effectively making up the shortfall, and the department's response is not, well, okay, you've run your reserves down, now we'll increase your allocation. It's, well, you're going to have to manage that, and presumably the subtext of that is you're going to have to cut payments.
No, I don't think that's right. The subtext would not have been you're going to have to cut payments, but we could not give them any indication what their allocation would be. When I say we, I'm talking about us in the blood policy team, because that was not within our gift. Allocations across the department, annual allocations for whatever purpose, were made obviously by ministers ultimately, and nobody was told what their allocation or even their likely allocation was going to be until all those decisions were made. And that was often very close to the end of a financial year. So we would have been remiss in giving Macfarlane any indication of hope at this stage that their allocation might be increased. They were giving us due warning, which was right to do, that they could continue to use their reserve for another 2 years, I think it said on the previous page, at the current levels. and by then they would be in serious difficulties. What we wanted them to do was to recognise the uncertainty about funding levels and allocations. I mean, they knew from year to year that we couldn't tell them until the decision had been made how much they might be getting for the following year. We wanted them to think about their approach to their funding policies so that it minimised the impact on beneficiaries. Now, clearly this was very difficult and ultimately a decision for them, and we were very much hoping that there would be significant changes within the intervening period of a couple of years. I think at this stage ministers were very much of the view that they wanted to reform the system. I believe that wasn't going to happen until after Lord Penrose reported, and his report was delayed by about a year, so it hadn't happened at this stage. But we were expecting that there would be some likely significant changes coming, but we were not in a position to be able to tell Macfarlane much about that.
I wonder if you can just go back a page, please. Thank you. Can you just help with the meaning, as it was intended to be read, of the last sentence on the page?
As you know, we have expressed our concern previously, yes?
Yes, about the sustainability of the Trust's payment schedules. A reader uninformed as to any particular context might think that this was saying you can't go on paying as you are doing.
My recollection of that, I think it may have been the previous year we had a discussion with them. They had increased their, shall we say, regular payments very considerably, and I think I remember observing, perhaps it was the previous year, that they had increased those regular payments well above the retail price index. So they'd made a decision to significantly increase payments. Clearly, once you increase payments, it's very difficult to bring them back down again. And so we were just concerned at the rate at which, you know, given the financial pressures on government at the time, we were just concerned that they thought carefully about how sustainable a decision might be in terms of increasing payments. I think that's my recollection of that.
Would you think that a reader reading that might think, we are being told we can't go on paying as we are? I appreciate you've just said the context that they had a hike up in rates the previous year. And therefore, we've got to do something about it. The obvious something is reducing the payments. It may be allowing it to simply atrophy over years, but... Yes,
it may have been allowing it to atrophy. I mean, the other... And obviously this was a decision for the trustees, and as I've mentioned, you know, we appreciated that it wasn't easy making these decisions, but the area in which it struck me that they may be able to make some reductions if they need to was in grant payments. Now, I'm not saying those grant payments weren't important or that they were not much appreciated by the beneficiaries who received them, but potentially a reduction there would have less impact than reducing payments that beneficiaries had come to rely on.
So, if they've come to rely upon the regular payments, the way of cutting their coat according to the cloth would be to reduce the amount paid by grants, which would mean that if people were in sudden and desperate need, they might not be.
They might, yes. I understand what you're saying in terms of the potential consequence of that And that was part of the difficulty that the trustees had, I must say, in trying to balance their decisions about where financial need was greatest and how they would help their beneficiaries.
So might they have understood this then as it were, a warning shot across their bows that they might not get the money they wanted if they went on as they wished to do?
I don't think I would class it as a warning shot across their bows. We were just trying to reiterate, and this wasn't just done by letter, this was done by frequent conversation and discussion. The pressures in the system were such that we couldn't guarantee continued levels of funding at the same level. We just wanted them to recognise that and to make sure that they did their best to develop policies, apply policies that would allow them to adjust to that if it happened. We weren't anticipating any significant reduction in money, but we couldn't make any guarantees about what they would receive.
So what would you say, or what did you say, I don't know, you may have said, to Roger Evans or a representative of the Trust who said, well, that's exactly why we kept a reserve?
And it wasn't that they didn't still have a fairly decent reserve at this stage, actually, because they did. As I remember, it was still probably in the order of possibly 2 million, somewhere between 1 and 2 million. So they still had a fairly substantial reserve.
Yes, so what would you have said? You could still got a substantial reserve, or what would it have been?
I may have said that. I can't tell you what I may have said.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Is it right to understand that the annual allocations for the charities were set by the department on the basis of what was affordable, not on the basis of what the need of the charity was?
I'm not sure initially whether affordability came into it. I don't know how the initial, I mean, this was before my time, so I'm talking about pre-2011. I'm not sure how those allocations were set, what the decisions were, but they tended then to be based on the previous year's allocation. So that was sort of, it became a sort of in perpetuity, if you like, the way of doing it.
So I'm conscious of the time. I've got a couple more questions on this topic, and then I've probably got about another 5 to 10 minutes. But that may take us over the...
So how long do you think you're going to need to finish?
At the outside, I would say 15 minutes.
Well, it has some repercussions, I think, for the shorthand writer, but let me nonetheless ask Dr. Jecock what she would prefer to do. You could have a break now if you feel in need of one, in which case we come back. There'll be 15, 20 minutes, Council estimates, of further questions. Then we have another break for however long it takes to enable those who are participating in this inquiry to invite Council to put questions which have arisen out of your testimony through her to you, and that'll be as long as it needs to garner those questions, probably about another half an hour, and then we come back and finish those questions. So you can have, as it were, 2 breaks, or we can go on for a quarter of an hour and just have the 1 break.
If it's acceptable to you and to your shorthand writer, I'm quite happy just to have the 1 break.
Well, let's do that, and if the shorthand writer objects, can she please, or he please, indicate on the text. Just see if there's an answer. Should we? Well, there's no objection, so let's go on.
Okay.
Do you recall there being discussion in the department about the moral case for providing appropriate funding to meet the needs of the beneficiaries?
I certainly remember there being discussion about there being a moral case for providing financial assistance, shall I say, financial support. I'm not sure that I recollect there being any discussion about providing, shall we say, appropriate funding for the charities. I did recognise personally, and I have said this in my statement, that if more money had been available, it was quite clear that there was a need amongst the beneficiaries. So from a personal point of view, I recognise that.
Yes, you said in your statement that you recognise that the funding allocated by the government was not sufficient to meet the needs of those affected, or to satisfy their wish for further support.
That's right.
Again, was that shared by other colleagues to your knowledge?
I don't honestly know.
But in terms of, I've used the word appropriate, but I think if I reframe that question and say, but in terms of there being discussion about there being a moral case to meet the needs of the beneficiaries, were there those kinds of discussions?
No, I don't believe there were.
I'm going to ask you some questions now about charitable need, and could we go please to MACF 5060_047. I'm going to take you to one of the documents that you may have been referring to earlier, in which questions were asked of McFarlane Trust by the department about this issue. So we can see, if we go to page 2 of this document, a third of the way down there, we can see it says, Dear Roger, so it's an email from Dr. White, CC'd into you, dated 7th of September 2012. And right at the bottom there, that's where I want to pick it up, we agree with your point about bringing up those MFT beneficiaries who have less income. And if we could go over the page, and I think that a principle, and I think and I think that is a principle which should find resonance with ministers. And then the next paragraph, the point I was making by referring to net average household income was that without any quantitative assessment of the level of needs among the beneficiaries and a statement of how the Trust will assess charitable need, ministers will look at the range of the beneficiaries' incomes and question whether there is a £4 million worth of charitable need. The absence of this information from the proposal was therefore a significant omission. And just pausing here, the context of this is it that the McFarlane Trust, having £4 million of reserves, was effectively justifying why it needed to spend that on its beneficiaries.
Yes, that's my understanding.
The objects of the Trust are quite clear in stating that its purpose is to meet the charitable needs of its beneficiaries. Because of this, we and ministers need to understand what standard of charitable needs the Trust is applying and what the level of charitable need among the beneficiary community actually is when considering funding issues affecting the Trust. The income of the beneficiaries is clearly central to that issue, albeit not necessarily the only relevant factor. We recognise that the income of the beneficiaries varies, as indeed does need. So, is it right to understand this, that the department is expressing some frustration with the McFarlane Trust, and frustration might be too strong a way of putting it, but that they are not setting out their case adequately to explain why, having got £4 million, why they need to spend it, and also why they need annual allocations and so on? It's just the message isn't coming through clearly enough.
Yeah, I think the message wasn't coming through clearly enough. I think that's my... I wasn't directly involved in this discussion and iteration. I saw the original proposal from the McFarlane Trust, and I think following that it was Ailsa White and Ben Cole who between them really corresponded with the Trust on what they needed to provide to demonstrate their case.
And they needed to demonstrate their case because, why do they need to demonstrate their case? Why could the department not just accept this is a cohort of people in desperate need?
Well, yes. because we needed to explain to ministers what the intentions were, I think, in terms of funding, and £4 million is obviously a significant amount of money as a reserve, and as I remember it, we needed to be able to just explain to ministers, yes, the Macfarlane Trust has this amount of money, they believe, and this is how they've assessed the need of their beneficiaries, and this is how they propose to spend it.
And was it your feeling that case could be made out, it just wasn't being made out?
Yes. I don't recollect at the time thinking, oh, they're not going to be able to justify it.
Can I ask you this? Did the department ever consider, or did you ever consider, whether the Macfarlane Trust or the other charities had to apply a test of charitable need, given that all of those beneficiaries on their books, if I can put it that way, had already proven that they were eligible for payments from the charity by meeting the eligibility criteria?
Yes, but meeting the eligibility criteria wouldn't necessarily mean that they, as individuals, would have charitable need, because as I think you showed in the, perhaps it's this document I'm referring to, beneficiaries' income would vary, and in some cases quite considerably. Some would be in a much better financial position than others, and potentially therefore less in need of the Trust's help.
But isn't charitable need a rather wider than
it is wide.
simply
Yes,
financial need?
But it certainly has, financial need certainly has some bearing on it, yes.
But in any event, that wasn't the approach that the department took as to how charitable need could be interpreted. Is that?
When you say that wasn't what?
So the idea that being within the cohort of people who could be beneficiaries of this trust was sufficient to show that they met. They had charitable need.
No, that wasn't the approach.
And just lastly, on the Alliance House organisations, did you have any concerns about whether the charities could act independently of the department, given the fact that they were entirely funded by the department?
No, actually, I didn't. I didn't see that should cause a problem. It was their decision as to what payment policies they put in place. We were sole funders, but I didn't see a conflict of interest there.
And I just have one more very short topic to ask you before I finish my questions, and it's in relation to consenting patients for transfusion. So is this right, that there was work being led in 2008, or starting in 2008, by SABTO on drawing up a robust process for informing patients of the risks of blood transfusions and having effectively a proper informed consent process? Is that your understanding?
That's broadly it, yes.
What role did the Department of Health and what role did you have in that issue?
Well, as head of blood policy at that stage, sorry, I wasn't head of blood policy at that stage, 2008, but I was supporting the committee. So the Secretariat was based on the blood policy team, and I was helping to support that. And we were fairly closely involved in working with, it was Catherine Howells, who was a committee member who led that piece of work. So we supported her in driving that piece of work forward.
And given the numbers of people who'd been infected via blood transfusions in the 1970s and 1980s, were you surprised that this work hadn't been done before?
I think there had been some efforts to do something, but I was a little surprised that it hadn't been done before, yes.
Now, you express a view in your witness statement. I don't think we need to go to it unless you want to, but you say that the earlier implementation of this informed consent process would not have affected the number of individuals considered to be at risk of developing VCJD.
In my opinion.
And what's the basis of that opinion?
Because although transfusion was on occasion inappropriately done, we knew that there were occasions when people were given transfusions when they didn't need to have them. I wasn't convinced that the numbers affected by that decision to have a transfusion or not to have a transfusion would have impacted on the numbers of people at risk of variant CJD. There were actually relatively few people at risk of who were identified as at risk of developing variant CJD. So I didn't really think that it was going to have a significant impact on that number.
So your starting position is relatively few people that were deemed to be at risk of VCJD for public health purposes as a result of transfusion, and so from that you come to the conclusion that you did.
That was my conclusion. But that doesn't mean to say that informed consent for transfusion is not really important. It is. And
just for those that I don't need to turn this up, but we can see the SABTO recommendations for this. WITN 0823026. We don't need to go to that, but just to note that was in January 2012 when SABTO sort of concluded this piece of work.
Right, yes.
Do you know why it took so long?
I do remember it taking a long time. I must admit I can't remember why it took so long. No, I'm afraid at the moment.
So those are the questions that I had for Dr. Jecock.
Thank you. Well, we'll take a break now. Now, how long do you think you might need?
I would have thought if we had, I don't know is the answer, but if we had between 20 minutes and half an hour.
Well, let us say not before 4:10, and then we'll come back and finish off your questions. I can't tell you quite how short or how long that will be. It will be what it is. But not before 4:10. If there's any change to that time, you'll be told.